It is a pleasure to be partnering with the Society for the Preservation of the Greek Heritage once again for this very timely conversation. And I'm very glad that I have with us tonight Vasilis Koliatsos, who is the one who inspires me and the one behind this wonderful initiative. So it is indeed timely, considering the challenges facing the study of the classics. Speaking from personal knowledge and experience, I know that ancient Greek texts are not relics of the past. They are powerful tools for understanding the complexities of the present. They pose questions that have resonated through the centuries and remain crucial today. They navigate universal questions that transcend time and culture. Among many things, the classics teach us the value of dialogue, of logic, of truth. And this is only the tip of the iceberg of the knowledge and wisdom that come with their study. They teach us about the complexities of human behavior, about citizenship and leadership. Ultimately, they are preparing us to navigate contemporary issues. These texts are not about exclusion. They offer lessons that are relevant to all of us. The Greek classics do not belong solely to Greece, but to the entire world, forming an essential part of our shared global heritage. Over the centuries, people have delved into these texts with new eyes each time, discovering fresh perspectives. By confronting the challenges of our own time through the lens of these works, we not only grow wiser, but also uncover new layers of meaning. But we must acknowledge that today, the role of the classics is at a crossroads. As the world evolves and academic priorities are shifting in an era increasingly driven by science, technology, and measurable outcomes, the study of ancient texts can be overshadowed. And yet, I believe that public interest thrives, as can be attested by the plethora of newly published books that navigate the ancient Greek world with new eyes, giving us enriched and broader perspectives. And while we must admit that the classics are being challenged, we must also see that the opportunities to reinvigorate their study are vast. But please do not take my words for all of this. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from scholars who have devoted their lives to the study of ancient worlds. They will guide us through the pressing issues surrounding classical studies today and explore how we can make these works more accessible and meaningful to new generations. We are joined by Dr. Eric Adler, Chair of Classics of the University of Maryland, Dr. Emmanuel Bourbouhakis, Associate Professor of Classics at Princeton University, Dr. Joseph Conlon, Professor of Classics and Director of the Greek Program at Ralston College in Savannah, Georgia. We are also fortunate to have as guide and moderator through this discussion Dr. Joshua Katz, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and previously Professor in the Humanities at Princeton. I'm confident that tonight's conversation will be an inspiring exchange of ideas, one that will spark interest and provoke us to think and mull over some fundamental questions ourselves. If I have not convinced you of the importance of our discussion tonight, then Vasilis Koliatsos, who has supported it and who inspired us to organize this, I'm sure that he will be more convincing.
Madame Ambassador, with a very heavy burden that I'm not sure I can respond to, I would like to welcome everyone here in this great event. Many thanks to the ambassador and Miss Mouroupalas and the staff of the embassy for opening once again this home of Greece at the heart of Washington, D.C., this very hospitable piece of Greek ground. This is a great time for us, for the society, as we celebrate our 50th anniversary in service of the Hellenic civilization through the ages. The seminal experiences of Greeks and Philhellenes and the lessons we learned and the importance of these lessons for our modern world. Civilization can change the world. And if I'm allowed to also speak as a physician, Madam Ambassador, it's also good for the soul. You see, soul is a domain that clergy and physicians have a claim to, so I can say something about this tonight. SPGH has done a lot in the past half century to promote and explore, sometimes with a critical eye, Hellenic civilization in its classical, medieval, and modern versions, with events ranging from lectures and panels to recitals, to concerts, with restoration efforts involving Byzantine monuments and neoclassical buildings in Greece, and signature initiatives like the repatriation of the Mycenaean treasure of Aidonia from a gallery in New York City to the Archaeological Museum of Athens in 1996. You can look at all of these and more, and you can even enjoy our unique collection of digitized books through the years in our website, spghworld.org. Again, spghworld.org. Homage to Miss Sofia Ekonomopoulou, who's here with us tonight, and my thanks for putting this all together. Tonight's event is our response to what we view as great challenge to the classical roots of Greek civilization, and what I think is a gathering threat to its canceling in academia and academic curricula, but eventually perhaps also in the collective consciousness of Western societies. This is, of course, a call on our identity of Greeks and Philhellenes. If we do not defend the classics, who would? That would be a simple way to put this argument. But the main reason we ring the bell tonight is what the ambassador mentioned, which is that it is not only crucial for us, it is also crucial for the American public at large. The founding fathers were declared students of the classical Greeks. And the American Republic and American life owes a lot to the ethics, civics, and aesthetics of the ancient Greeks. Just look around. It's inscribed everywhere in these buildings in the capital of the United States. So, with the great help of a distinguished scholar and a lovely human being, Professor Joshua Katz of the American Enterprise Institute, we have put together two panels the distinguished scholars are here sitting on that table. The first panel this evening is devoted to laying out the problem, put the problem on the table, along with all the associated challenges. In the next panel, a month from today, we will go deeper. We will delve into the issue of relevance, which again, as the ambassador said, not that the classics are important for us, Greeks and Philhellenes, but they're important for everyone, regardless of heritage. Now, Joshua will moderate both panels, including the panel tonight, and I'm going to invite him to the podium so that we can start the main part of the ceremonies. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Madam Ambassador, Professor Koliatzos, members of the Society for the Preservation of the Greek Heritage, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome such a crowd to the Embassy of Greece, where we have ahead of us this evening a program that is certain to be exceptionally intellectually stimulating. And I'm confident of this for many reasons. One is that how could any discussion of the Greek classics not be exceptionally intellectually stimulating? Another is that I have great admiration for the braininess of our three panelists, whom I will introduce properly some minutes from now. And a third is that the leadership of the Society and I chose these three panelists with particular care, knowing that they possess fundamental qualities that seem sometimes to be in short supply these days among academics, namely equanimity and a seriousness of mind appropriate to the topic today, which is, in truth, a difficult one. Because we are here to discuss a crisis. We are here to discuss not just Greek classics as such, not just Homer and Aristotle and the Berlin painter and Anna Komnene, but the crisis that surrounds their study in the American Academy. And frankly, it is not easy to discuss crises well. We hardly need this topic or this event to understand the basic fact that we are living in an increasingly polarized environment and are not always doing a good job of maintaining political order or democratic norms. And I hardly need remind this of all groups that the words political and democratic are words that we have borrowed in English from Greek. Emotions run high, disagreement frequently turns uncivil, and there is a tendency for people to spend more time complaining about one another and airing their grievances over how we got into this crisis in the first place than articulating calm proposals for how we now get ourselves out of it. I am glad to say, however, that what binds our panelists today, aside from outstanding teaching and scholarship, and aside from an openness of heart and mind, is the willingness to throw themselves selflessly into tricky situations and to remind us, their interlocutors, that the Academy is not supposed to be a nest of vipers, but is in fact precisely about outstanding teaching and scholarship and openness of heart and mind, and the willingness to assess the merits of all positions and to make progress through the search for truth. Does this sound a little bit like Plato's Academy, founded in Athens around 387 BC? Well, it should, because academy, academia, and academic too are, of course, other terms that English has borrowed from Greek. And this brings me back to yet another Greek term, crisis. When you think of the word, you almost certainly think of bad things. And that is why our topic today is so difficult, as I have said it is. And yet, from one important point of view, a crisis is not all bad. Indeed, a crisis can be good. In ancient Greece, krisis, often translated as decision or judgment, could refer to a turning point, and specifically in the medical literature, to a turning point in the progression of a disease. Yes, the patient might die, But with the appropriate care, the turning point in the progression of a disease could be positive, and the patient might live and indeed thrive. Our three panelists, doctors all, though not of the medical variety, like Professor Koliatzos, are among the very best scholars I know, both to diagnose the crisis I mean in the bad sense, and to prescribe the right medicine so that the Greek and Latin classics, and in particular the Greek ones, may once again be held in deservedly high esteem. Now, it's no secret that public trust in American higher education is at an all-time low, especially at elite institutions. In the past year or two alone, protests have been rocking campuses. People are arguing fiercely about the limits on free speech, the ancient Greek term for which, parrhesia, is, be it noted, a cornerstone of democratic practice. Plagiarism has become a hot topic, as has the use and misuse of ChatGPT. The Supreme Court made race-based affirmative action illegal, and everyone has an opinion about student loan forgiveness. Unlike in the past, distrust in academia is now universal. It's not bipartisan, though, because, to be sure, progressives and conservatives object to very different things. But what is undeniable is that just about everybody considers the reputation of the Ivy League and its peers to be seriously tarnished. Nor, of course, do the problems in our colleges and universities arise out of nowhere. Trust in primary and secondary education and in teachers' unions is also extremely low, a lack of confidence that the COVID pandemic manifestly exacerbated. Now, scholars have traced our social and educational malaise back to the election of President Trump in 2016, to the first iPhone with a front-facing camera in 2010, to the interest in deconstruction in the 1980s, to the countercultural 1960s, back even to Americans' fascination with German Wissenschaft, with German science in the late 19th century. And there's much to be said about all of these perspectives, and indeed large tomes continue to be written about them, especially from the perspective of the humanities. But classics, by which I mean in the first place the study of the history, languages, and cultural artifacts of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and territories under ancient Greek and Roman rule, classics was until very recently a bulwark of traditionalism. Most classicists and would-be classicists, students, teachers, and professors, prided themselves on what one might call their countercultural counterculture, or to put it more simply, they prided themselves on their culture. They delighted in the range and depth of their learning, in their attention to detail, in the wonders of an academic discipline that expected its practitioners to care about books and battles, about philosophy and potsherds, about everything from alpha to omega, as it were. While other fields that I will not name dumbed things down and no longer expected people to know much of anything, classics remained a jewel, some would say the jewel of the humanistic curriculum. And so, when classics fell, as it did in the last decade, it fell hard and it fell fast. Whatever problems existed in the field of classics before then, and yes, of course there were problems, I know of no academic field that went from pride to self-loathing as quickly as ancient Greek and Roman studies did. It's a sad fact that there are now regular fiery calls to burn classics down, calls to burn down the field made, I stress, by people who are remarkably themselves in the field. Some are protected by tenure, like the Ivy League professor best known for her work on ancient Athenian tragedy and modern Greek literature, who wrote in a public-facing essay in 2021 that she is, quote, eager for a fire, and, quote, would rather see the current incarnation of classics burn than fossilize. what an abuse of privilege it is to be able to say, in effect, hey, I've made it now, I have tenure, and I'm just going to destroy the path that I trod so that people can't come after me and follow. Others who call for burning down classics are those who do indeed follow nonetheless. Students who become intoxicated on apocalyptic rhetoric, as young people often do, and are seemingly unable to articulate what brought them to ancient Greece and ancient Rome in the first place. How baffling it is that a person would enroll in courses and pursue a degree in a subject that he or she detested. Now, to be clear, there are plenty of classicists who do care deeply about their subject. But most of these scholars today are keeping a low profile. They're not standing up to the anti-intellectual, illiberal cultural vandals, and they're just hoping and praying that no one notices them as they go about the work that they love. Most of them, in other words, are unlike our three panelists this evening, all of whom exhibit devotion to traditional classics and devotion to expanding classics beyond the traditional, without in any way burning it down. And, well, they also exhibit what I can only call bravery. Bravery for being willing to speak out and doing so in a measured way that commands, or at least ought to command, wide respect. Now, this evening is not specifically, I should say, about Princeton University, where I used to be on the faculty, where one of our panelists remains a professor, and where there are general celebrations that U.S. News and World Report last month ranked it the #1 university in the nation for the 14th year in a row. This even as one charismatic Roman historian with a significant public persona instigates students to occupy campus buildings in support of terrorist organizations like Hamas, and says repeatedly that he hopes that classics as it is traditionally practiced dies, and, quote, dies as swiftly as possible. So again, this evening is not specifically about Princeton, of course. But when Princeton and places like Princeton do something, Americans pay attention. And because Princeton has indeed been doing a thing or two in classics, I do have to bring into our discussion tonight the fact that a fact that I think most would agree is the single most egregious failure of intellectual leadership and good sense in the field in decades. Namely, in the spring of 2021, the Department of Classics at Princeton did something truly shocking, namely decide to allow undergraduates to receive a bachelor's degree in classics without knowing so much as one word of Greek or Latin. Naturally, most people outside academia consider this a crisis, a suicidal turning point. Imagine majoring in Japanese and not knowing Japanese. Imagine majoring in Brazilian politics and not knowing any Portuguese. Imagine, and this is, I think, not a huge stretch from the other examples, imagine calling yourself a mathematician and not knowing how to add or subtract. And yet, for reasons that have at least in part to do with what is these days called racial equity, Princeton decided to show the world that it is, I'm afraid, not a serious institution. And the result was that classicists around the country and in the Anglophone world more generally cheered. In fact, in her official address in 2022 to the largest professional society of classicists in North America, the president of the Society for Classical Studies told her audience with terrifying aplomb that Princeton does not deserve so much credit for this wonderful new policy of its because it was a latecomer. All manner of small institutions had already done away with the language requirement, and how great that was. To quote an article in defense of classics published just last week in the Stanford Review by 2 Stanford math majors, quote, "The barbarians are at the gate." This is a small snapshot of the state of classics in American academia in the 21st century. And there's much more that I could say, some of which I have put into print or spoken about at events that have been recorded. But the people you really want to hear from are the three at the table, and it is high time that I introduce to you my friends and colleagues and explain why I consider them the ideal people to speak to us this evening about crisis. So first up is Professor Eric Adler, a professor of classics and the chair of the classics department at the University of Maryland, just up the road in College Park. Professor Adler is the preeminent historian of the field of classics in the United States. There is, simply put, no one better equipped to assess the question of how we got to where we are. And there is also no one else who can talk about where we are while still earning respect from both traditionalists and anti-traditionalists, because Professor Adler is scrupulously fair, never hesitating to point out errors of fact, failures of imagination, and hypocrisy wherever they are to be found. Trained as a Roman historiographer, Professor Adler, who has a PhD from Duke, is the author of a number of books, including two that are indispensable reading for those who care about the issues before us this evening. Classics, The Culture Wars and Beyond, published by the University of Michigan Press in 2016, and The Battle of Classics, How a 19th Century Debate Can Save the Humanities Today, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. After Professor Adler, we will hear from Professor Emmanuel Bourbouhakis, an associate professor of classics and Hellenic studies at Princeton University. What Professor Bourbouhakis brings to the table are, above all, an expansive knowledge of Greek history and culture and an unusual willingness to say exactly what he thinks about matters of public interest, including about the current state of academia and the crisis in classics, to which he has a front row seat. He speaks with authority about everything from the Bronze Age to the current Prime Minister of Greece, with an emphasis on his specialty, Byzantine literature, into which category falls his impressively learned 2017 edition of and commentary on the Bishop Eustathius of Thessaloniki's political eulogy of the Byzantine Emperor Emmanuel I Komnenos. In an age of hyper-specialization, Professor Bourbouhakis, who has a PhD from Harvard, shows that it is possible to carve out a niche for oneself while also being a trusted and caring teacher and advisor on both more conventionally classical subjects and turmoil in the modern world. Finally, after Professors Adler and Bourbouhakis, the floor goes to Professor Joseph Conlon, a professor of classics and the director of the Greek program at Ralston College, an upstart institution in Savannah, Georgia, that focuses on the liberal arts and offers a master's degree in the humanities. Professor Conlon, who has a PhD from Princeton, is the author of a forthcoming commentary on the Roman playwright Plautus's Persa, and a translation into English of a novel by Alexandros Papadiamantis. But he is with us this evening, above all, because he is an astoundingly talented linguist. Fluent in ancient Greek, modern Greek, Latin, Russian, and maybe 5 or 6 other languages besides, and he is the most jaw-droppingly successful teacher of so-called dead languages I have ever seen. I do not wish to preempt what Professor Conlon will say, but while the study of classics in elite institutions of higher learning is faltering, interest in classical education for kindergartners through 12th graders is rising rapidly, as it is among students at a host of new and newly invigorated humanistically oriented colleges, some of them secular, like Ralston, and others religious. This is, in my view, the best reason for hope. 18-year-olds will increasingly be arriving at college with a firmer understanding of Greek and Latin fundamentals than some of their teachers, which should be quite a spectacle. Professor Conlon, who has taught students of all ages, including high schoolers, is extremely well positioned to lead the way in this nascent revolution. So one last thing. As you've already heard from Professor Koliatzos, this evening is the first of a 2-part program. A little over a month from now, on Thursday, November 14th, the Society for the Preservation of the Greek Heritage will be presenting one more panel that the ambassador and her staff have graciously agreed to host at the embassy. That panel will be on the enduring relevance of Greek classics for the modern world. Once again, I will be presiding, and I look forward to seeing you there. In the meantime, however, with thanks to all of you for your attention and patience, I now hand things over to today's panelists, beginning with Professor Adler.
Thank you, Joshua, for that very kind introduction. It is a delight to be here to speak on such an important topic. I will confess that I am fighting the very end of a cough, and as a result, I have a cough drop, and will hopefully make it through without any coughing fits or spitting out the cough drop, and that is my vision of success, if I may. All right. Now that I've set the bar really, really low, the title of my talk this evening is The Demise of the Classics in the U.S., a Crisis 150 Years in the Making. Although the vicissitudes of American higher education have understandably led observers to talk about the crisis of the classical humanities in U.S. colleges and universities, I'm going to argue that our current crisis is actually the result of a concerted and long-standing effort to reduce the influence of the classics on American undergraduates. This effort dates back over 150 years, roughly to the second half of the 1860s. I'm going to show that around this time, the founders of the American university movement established a curriculum that by design reduced the role of the classics in higher education. This late 19th century alteration to the American college curriculum amounted to an attack on the classical humanities from which they have never recovered. To understand the nature of this attack on the study of the classics, we're first going to have to discuss higher education in early America, from the colonial period to the end of the U.S. Civil War in 1865. As it turns out, the colleges in early America were very different sorts of institutions from the colleges and universities that we're used to today. For one thing, the early American colleges served a very small population of students. According to the historian Frederick Rudolph, for example, in 1870, only 1.7% of Americans aged 18 to 21 were enrolled in America's colleges. Although not all these young Americans who attended the early American colleges were wealthy, the early colleges were places that were seen as fit for the training of future members of the elite. Importantly, the curriculum students experienced in the early American colleges was drastically different from the sorts of curricula that dominate U.S. higher education today. In the early American colleges, there were no majors and no minors. Typically, these colleges afforded very little choice to students in regard to coursework. Instead, students in the early American colleges largely took the same course of studies, the exact same classes in the exact same order. And this prescribed, that is to say required curriculum, granted a far more profound role to the study of the classics than is the case today. This state of affairs was largely due to the intellectual influence of Renaissance humanism on the early American colleges. Renaissance humanism was a movement that originated in Italy during the 13th century AD. It was a movement profoundly inspired by a devotion to the study of authors from Greco-Roman antiquity. The Renaissance humanists, who were influenced by ancient Greek and Roman approaches to elite education, promoted a vision of education that was rooted in the study of ancient Greek and Latin authors. Starting in Italy in the 13th century, the Renaissance humanists advocated for a new kind of pedagogy, one rooted in the study of authors from Greco-Roman antiquity, and one that supposedly offered very different benefits from those encouraged by medieval scholasticism. To the Renaissance humanists, the goal of education was the shaping of character. And the humanists believed that the study of ancient Greek and Latin literature in their original languages was the key to the proper shaping of one's character. For their new curriculum, the Renaissance humanists promoted the study of Roman and Greek literature, history, and moral philosophies as guides for how one ought to live one's life. To the Renaissance humanists, students should focus their study on authors from Greek and Roman antiquity alone. Those authors were worth studying, whereas other authors were not worth studying. As a result, the humanists recommended the study of writers such as Homer and Thucydides and Cicero and Virgil. These authors offered students both wisdom and eloquence. And the study of these authors in their original languages could perfect the human being. As it turns out, the Renaissance humanist vision of education was dominant in Western institutions of higher education for hundreds of years. In fact, it wasn't until the 19th century AD that the cardinal influence of Renaissance humanism in Western higher education began to wane. For this reason, Renaissance humanism was the dominant intellectual and pedagogical influence on the early American colleges. Given the influence of Renaissance humanism on the early American colleges, ancient Greek and Latin played the primary role in US higher education until the late 19th century. According to Frederick Rudolph, for example, prior to 1745, Latin and ancient Greek were the lone subjects required of students who were entering the American colleges. The goal of shaping character of students, primarily through an engagement with classical Greek and Latin authors, loomed large in the pedagogical mission of the early American colleges. This helps explain why the early American colleges boasted an overwhelmingly prescribed curriculum. It was believed that certain authors were conduits for students to understand the good life, and thus all students were expected to study the works of those authors. Although the early American colleges also compelled students to study other subjects, for example, mathematics and biology, the classical humanities dominated the curriculum and thereby dominated the secondary educations of the college-bound. But, as I previously suggested, after the conclusion of the American Civil War, American higher education would change significantly. From close to the start of American higher education, there were numerous calls to limit the strongly classical orientation of the American colleges. Throughout the course of the antebellum period in the United States, proponents of various non-classical subjects vied for these subjects to receive greater attention in the collegiate curriculum. Since most, if not all, courses in the early colleges were prescribed, the addition of new disciplines to the curriculum threatened the curricular dominance of the classical languages. The natural sciences amounted to the chief threat to the centering of the college curriculum around the classical languages. The Renaissance humanists had largely shunned the natural sciences because their studies supposedly did not contribute to the perfection of the individual. As the Enlightenment of the 18th century wore on, however, the exclusion of the natural sciences became increasingly difficult to defend. The study of the natural sciences implicitly attacked the intellectual rationale associated with Renaissance humanism. For the humanists, as we already stressed, the goal of education was the shaping of character. The natural sciences, on the other hand, first and foremost aimed to produce new knowledge. By and large, one does not study, say, chemistry in order to revel in the inherited wisdom of great women and men from the past. Instead, one studies chemistry principally in order to create new knowledge. As early as the late 18th century in America, supporters of the natural sciences clamored for their greater inclusion in the American college curriculum. Many defenders of the prescribed classical curriculum understandably deemed the natural sciences a threat. Although there were hints of changes to US higher education during America's early history, these changes became far more dramatic in the aftermath of the US Civil War. Contributing to these changes was the professionalization of Western higher education, a process that originally commenced in Germany in the late 18th century and influenced American higher education by the late 19th century. German research universities pioneered the PhD degree, which required that prospective professors undergo rigorous graduate training in their chosen field of expertise. Prior to this professionalization, teaching at American colleges seems largely to have been a temporary job rather than a career. In early America, even at the most established colleges, instruction was chiefly in the hands of the college president and some academic tutors who were typically recent college graduates themselves. Before the German influence on American education in the late 19th century, even professors in the American colleges often had little advanced training in their subjects of expertise. Most often, their presumed moral strengths recommended them for their jobs, and many would move on to careers in the ministry. Such a background fit educational institutions that were chiefly concerned with the molding of character. It also fit an intellectual atmosphere that prided itself on the examination of the received wisdom of authors from classical antiquity, rather than on the creation of new knowledge. In the late 19th century in America, however, many of the elements of early American higher education started to change, as American colleges began to take their cues from alterations that had first occurred in Germany. Although it would take decades of effort and meet with much resistance, during the 19th century, the American colleges slowly reoriented themselves toward Germany. Professionalization, specialization, and research ultimately became essential features of American academic life. By the turn of the 20th century in the United States, for example, the PhD became an obligatory degree for the prospective American professor. Additionally, in the late 19th century in the US, the faculty of US colleges split up into distinct academic departments based on their subjects of expertise. So there's now a biology department and a classics department and so forth. The late 19th century in America also witnessed the further broadening of potential subjects to study at American institutions of higher learning. Some of these subjects, for example, domestic science, physical education, and sanitary science, were more vocational in their emphases than were the traditional subjects associated with the ancient liberal arts. Importantly, along with these and other changes in American higher education in the late 19th century came the demise of the old prescribed classical curriculum. This fundamental change to the undergraduate curriculum in America was inaugurated by men responsible for moving higher education away from the tradition of the old classical colleges to the research universities that are so prominent in the United States today. These men, the first of whom flourished in the late 19th century, have been called by the historian Andrew Jewett the scientific Democrats, first generation of scientific Democrats. Many of these scientific Democrats were themselves social or natural scientists by training, and they deliberately sought to reorient American higher education around the natural and social sciences. According to the scientific Democrats, the scientific method could provide the intellectual framework necessary to make the United States a cohesive democracy that fomented evidence-based solutions to contemporary problems. They therefore aimed to center the U.S. college curriculum on the scientific method. This entailed greatly reducing the role that the classical humanities and Christian theology had previously played in American higher education. In short, the scientific Democrats, that is to say the creators of the American university movement, aimed to marginalize classical studies in U.S. institutions of higher learning. The most prominent figure associated with the demise of the old prescribed classical curriculum in American higher education is a man named Charles W. Eliot. Eliot served as the president of Harvard University from 1869 until 1909. He became the most tireless advocate of an undergraduate curriculum based on the so-called elective system. Eliot advocated the removal of the prescribed classical curriculum. He favored an elective-based system which allowed undergraduates to choose any courses that they wanted to take. Eliot's support for a system of freely elective courses was based on his vision of the contemporary university as a free market, a space in which competition would occur between the disciplines, to the supposed benefit of both the students and to the disciplines themselves. Eliot also likened the elective curriculum to social Darwinism. In an essay he originally published in 1884, for example, Eliot wrote that, quote, "In education as elsewhere, it is the fittest that survives," end quote. Not coincidentally, Eliot was a disciple of the British social Darwinist Herbert Spencer. Implicit in the elective system is a major change in the intellectual mission of American colleges and universities. The Renaissance humanists had argued that the study of ancient Greek and Roman authors was the key to the perfection of the human being. Now those ideals were being cast aside. The elective system, which spread like wildfire in the late 19th century in the United States, signaled that there were many different kinds of knowledge, and none was necessarily more important than any other. According to Eliot and other advocates of the elective system, a college education was chiefly about introducing students to certain discipline-based skills. The elective system contends that one does not need to understand any specific content in order to deem oneself an educated person. Now, to be sure, there have been numerous reforms to Eliot's elective system since it was first inaugurated in the late 19th century. The Johns Hopkins University appears to have inaugurated the academic major and minor in 1877. The major and minor system requires students to take a certain number of courses in a specific discipline, which would become a focus of their studies. Similarly, American educators have experimented with different types of general education since the demise of the old classical curriculum. These days, undergraduates typically must take a number of courses in a variety of disciplines as part of their so-called general education. Thus, for example, many students are compelled to enroll in a class or two in the humanities, a class or two in the natural sciences, and so forth. This is called the distribution model of general education. But importantly, these new sorts of curricula, which owe their origins to changes that took place in higher education starting in the 19th century, removed the study of Greek and Roman classics from their central position in American higher education. This was precisely what the scientific Democrats who founded our professional research universities wanted, and that's what they got. These days, even students at the most prestigious American colleges and universities are not required to study ancient Greek and Latin. The pioneers of the elective system in American higher education at least implicitly likened their curriculum to a Darwinian survival of the fittest. The fittest disciplines would supposedly attract the most students, and the least fit disciplines would die, and rightly so. But many have recognized that the elective system really sets up a survival of the unfittest. Human nature being what it is, students often attempt to enroll in the easiest courses, the easiest majors. Given the intrinsic difficulties associated with the study of a non-native language, classics was never going to win this competition for student enrollment. Although contemporary American colleges and universities often trumpet their commitment to the creation of global citizens, many of these institutions engage in watering down or eliminating their foreign language requirements because most undergraduates don't want to take challenging courses as part of their general education. These changes to the American college curriculum in the late 19th century have led to the diminishment of the classical tradition in the United States. The original scientific Democrats probably didn't foresee the precarious place for the classics that exists today. After all, in the late 19th century, the study of ancient Greek and Latin still possessed tremendous cachet in polite society. But this is no longer the case, and thus the only American institutions at which the study of Greek and Latin is reasonably safe are ultra-elite universities that are wealthy enough to be able to retain marginalized disciplines. This state of affairs has been ruinous for the classics in America. It has served to cut off most Americans from a tradition that profoundly shaped our country, in part through the classical educations of the founding fathers. It has also meant that students in American institutions of higher learning possess no common culture. Thanks to the elective system and distribution requirements, one cannot presume that a college graduate has read even one particular book, not the Iliad, not the Bible, not the Analects of Confucius, and so forth. Perhaps most concerningly, the move to the elective system has meant the marginalization of character development as a fundamental goal of American higher education. Renaissance humanism, for all its faults and its intellectual narrowness, at least compelled students to read books that are of fundamental importance for students to ponder their answers to life's great questions. Our current system cannot distinguish between Plato's Republic and comic books. They are all simply texts through which students can learn discipline-based skills. In short, we have inherited an approach to undergraduate education which by design diminishes the role of the classics and humanism. I think that's very troubling, both for an individual's future happiness and for the future of our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First, I should like to join my colleagues in thanking the Embassy of the Hellenic Republic and Ambassador Nassika for hosting this event, and of course the Society for the Preservation of the Greek Heritage for sponsoring this important discussion. It is only fitting that we take up the question of crisis in the study of classics before an audience and on the sovereign territory of a nation who are bound to the Greek classics in both senses of that term. On the train ride down from New Jersey, it occurred to me that Society for the Preservation of the Greek Heritage, under whose auspices we have gathered, is about as fitting a name for my profession as one might think of. After all, what is the field of classics, if not an organization, or eteria, if I may be permitted the use of this still resonant term, formed in order to ensure that our Hellenic heritage, broadly conceived, will be available for future generations, not simply to cherish or extol, though it certainly furnishes us with good reasons to do both, but also to contend with, to test their own intellectual structures against its accumulated resilience, and in doing so, to be prodded and inspired to rise above our own inevitably parochial perspective by a cultural heritage whose hallmark is its enduring relevance over millennia and across remarkably diverse societies. It is this last aspect of Hellenism that I wish to remark on briefly this evening, namely, its role as a corrective against intellectual, cultural, and ideological parochialism. I will draw on an instructive example from the last days of Byzantium, whose role in fostering and extending Hellenism is only partially and then often poorly understood. Sometime during the decade that saw the final conquest of Byzantine Constantinople by the Ottoman Turkish forces of the 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II, an equally young man, born to a well-to-do Athenian family, who had received as good a classical education, including, it seems, Latin, as anyone in the previous millennium and a half, together with a formative period of study under the infamously pagan Platonist Gemistos Plethon, who quixotically urged a Hellenic rebirth through a return to paganism and pre-Christian philosophy. This young man, known to us as Laonikos Chalkokondylis, he changed his name probably from the Christian Nikolaos to the more ancient-sounding Laonikos, set about writing a history of the demise of the Greeks of his day and the rise of the Turks. By itself, this was no great innovation. Byzantine historians of the 15th century could see the writing on the wall and had already begun chronicling Ottoman conquests over formerly Byzantine, or as it was known, Roman territory. What set Laonikos apart, what makes him a fitting subject for our discussion, was his decision to structure his account much as the classical historian Herodotus had done when he described how the Greeks rallied to defeat the invading Persians. Laonikos' choice of Herodotus was unusual for many reasons. While we know him today as the father of historical writing, Herodotus was read largely for his ethnographic information that he furnished about far-off lands and the customs of their peoples. He was also used as a model of fluent and engaging narrative prose. What's more, to the Byzantines, who saw themselves as Roman imperial subjects governed by an emperor, the defense of Greek civil liberty at the heart of Herodotus's narrative seemed quaint and remote. But surely the most obvious reason Herodotus might not have seemed the likeliest model for Laonikos must be that the Greeks of Laonikos' time lost the war against the invader from the east. And here we find the first lesson of Laonikos' Hellenism, an ability to see beyond narrow questions of identity. Laonikos decided not to eulogize the plight of Greco-Roman and Christian Byzantium, but to use it as a foil for a compelling and dispassionate account of the rise of the Islamic Ottoman Empire and the dawn of a new age for the Eastern Mediterranean world, while simultaneously looking well beyond those contours to survey the wider world increasingly coming into focus after the mid-15th century. And while Laonikos' loyalty to the Greek cause is never in doubt, it also never clouds his estimate of the Ottoman Empire, the customs and self-understanding of the Turks, and most notably, the nature of Islam, whose origins and practices he describes with scrupulous detachment in the manner of an anthropologist, or more precisely, in the manner of Herodotus. I will not attempt to distill here Laonikos' dense and wide-ranging historical account. I urge you to procure a copy of the English translation, a very fine English translation, by my colleague Anthony Kaldelis, with facing page Greek text, I might add, in the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library series, published by Dumbarton Oaks right here in Washington. Instead, I would like to dwell on a couple of features of Laonikos' histories which I think speak to our predicament, as we try to safeguard the Greek and more widely classical heritage by reacquainting ourselves with its enduring capacity to coax us out of our intellectual and ideological provincialism. Ever since their appearance centuries earlier and their piecemeal displacement and eventual domination of the Arabs, the Turks had remained opaque to the Greco-Roman Byzantines. Their adoption of Islam rendered them all the more incomprehensible, since Islam was regarded not as a separate religion, possessed of its own historical integrity, but as born of profound theological error. We have many Byzantine theological polemics against Islam, a few even from the pen of some emperors, one of which caused an international scandal a few years back when it was quoted by the late Pope Benedict XVI. But almost no attempts were made to understand the tenets of Islam, or more importantly, its history according to its own believers, as mired in legend as any religion is bound to be, of course, or the rationale of Muslim customs and the ideology underpinning the collective identity of the Turks. Everything about the circumstances in which Laonikos wrote his historical work lent itself to the conventional medieval view of a clash between Christians and Muslims. Laonikos' recasting of this conflict, following the template of the wars between the Greece of Marathon, Salamis, and Thermopylae, and the Persia of King Xerxes, has been mistakenly read sometimes as a distorting and escapist desire to view the world through a classical lens. But this is to miss the radical departure of Laonikos' use of Herodotus. Herodotus furnished Laonikos with a model of history which rendered the enemy's perspective intelligible, much as Herodotus had given the Greeks of his time an account of Persian imperial politics, regardless of how accurate we may now regard that account. The benefit lies less in accuracy than it does in the posing of the question and being forced to enlarge one's understanding in order to answer it. Laonikos devotes the better part of his histories to the Turkish perspective. With a genius for paradox nurtured by ancient Greek literature, he presents successive Turkish sultans as unable to imagine fully conquering the Greeks of Europe. Recall that Constantinople lies on the European side of the Bosphorus Straits, because they are unable to look past the very same ancient precedents in which the invading Eastern empires of the Persians had failed. In this telling, it is the Turks who suffer from a narrow reading of classical history. No less interesting, Laonikos depicts the Turkish Sultan Mehmed as an often depraved classical tyrant, cruel and self-indulgent, an autocrat Herodotus's readers over the millennia might have recognized in the account of Persian despots. Notably, Laonikos regards Mehmed's Ottoman subjects as no less oppressed by the Sultan than the people he conquers. Perhaps most importantly, by seeing his world through a Herodotean, classical lens, Laonikos breaks with his contemporaries and does not ascribe the Sultan's depravity or Ottoman cruelty to Islam, rightly or wrongly is beside the point here, but to his character. By adopting a classical frame of historical analysis, Laonikos renders the Turks intelligible while preserving their distinctness. He would no doubt be branded an orientalizing Western historian by some today, because he follows Herodotus in his portraiture of this Eastern empire as ruled by utterly ruthless means. But that, as we say, is to miss the point entirely, something we are increasingly good at in our cultural debates. Prompted by the apparent reversal of what he had read in Herodotus, namely, the defeat of the Greeks and the rise of the Eastern Empire of the Turks, who were the latest barbarians to threaten the Byzantine Empire, Laonikos saw that the value of Herodotus's approach lay not in who won and who lost, but in the advantage of investigating the qualities and customs which might have led to either loss or victory. To mitigate against the tendency to eulogize Greek losses and lament Turkish victories, Laonikos adopted a Thucydidean style, substituting detached analysis for the emotional rhetoric of his contemporaries. What enabled Laonikos to ask questions, to inquire, as the original meaning of historia would have it, about the nature of Islamic belief and Ottoman imperial rule, was the commitment to Herodotus's inquisitiveness, which prompted Laonikos to widen what had been a fatally narrow horizon of understanding on the part of the Byzantines, whose own classicism had grown self-satisfied and complacent, too much a matter of form and social distinction instead of a source of renewal. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Laonikos drank more deeply from the well of his classical education. Whereas most had been reading Herodotus as an exemplar of fluent, if somewhat dialectically exotic prose, Herodotus, you will recall, is known for employing the Ionian dialect. Laonikos read Herodotus for his intellectual and ideological content, something no one had done for well over a millennium. But Laonikos' sustained and dynamic engagement with Hellenism would prove as unpredictable and inventive as nearly every previous or subsequent encounter with Hellenism over the millennia, whether by the Jews of Alexandria in the centuries following the conquests of Alexander, or the revolutionary politicians of colonial America after they had thrown off the British yoke. Laonikos' repurposing of the Greek versus barbarian or Persian dichotomy had an added purpose: to salvage, or rather to fashion, a Hellenic national identity from the ruins of a long-spent Roman ideological one. It would be centuries before this effort would bear fruit in the uprising of the Greeks and the birth, or as it was then cast, the rebirth of a Greek state, an independence movement passionately supported by the nascent American nation, whose own founding fathers credited Hellenism and their classical education with teaching them, first and foremost, to question the premises of their world. In its own peculiar fashion, the example of Laonikos illustrates, I think, Hellenism's enduring function as an intellectual, ideological, and aesthetic proving ground. The neglected central idea of classical education, distorted as much by sterile veneration as it is by sanctimonious vilification. I began by noting that too much of our discussion about the crisis in classical education suffers from a parochialism, which, perhaps ironically, the classics are meant to compensate for. Not because the Greeks and Romans were themselves not capable of similar parochialism. The ancient Greeks famously avoided learning foreign languages until they no longer couldn't. But I would ask us to consider not only the horizon inherent in the legacy of Greek antiquity itself, but the added horizon of Hellenism as a cultural practice over the course of millennia and across places as far away from our own as Laonikos' uncertain world. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. I have been asked tonight to speak in addition to the topic, the crisis that the classical education is currently facing in America, to also offer something of a prescription for how we can go about fixing this and perhaps even sketch a vision for the future, how the teaching of Latin and Greek may look, well, in the very near future, as I hope. The main argument, the main thesis that I'd like to address over the course of the next 20 minutes or so is that the crisis that we are facing in classical education can be addressed most effectively through language pedagogy. And now, depending on your perspective, this might seem very obvious or this might seem like a bold claim, but I hope over the course of the talk to show why I feel that that is the case and to show really what can be achieved through changing the methods, not just focusing on the fact of transmission itself, but the mode of transmission, the way that Greek and Latin are taught. And I'll start using myself as an example because I think that I'm a great example of why the way that Greek and Latin are taught don't work. There's a true failure and a true abdication of responsibility among people that teach Latin and ancient Greek. I myself studied ancient Greek for about 5 years, and at the end of those 5 years, I still did not know Greek. And what I mean, I knew a lot about Greek. If you gave me a paragraph of Plato, I could identify all of the infinitives and the optatives and the subjunctives. I could tell you where the genitive absolutes were and what tense the participle was. But if you pressed me at the end of it to tell you what Plato was actually talking about, I probably wouldn't be able to do that. And by the way, to get through that paragraph probably would have taken me an hour or an hour and a half. And to do that, I needed not only my text of Plato, but maybe 2 or 3 translations, a commentary, a lexicon, a Greek grammar book, Deniston's Greek particles to make sure I didn't miss any of the nuances of Plato's uses of particles, and perhaps an entire research library. And still, after 5 years of quite serious and diligent study of ancient Greek, I was unable to do the thing that I wanted to do when I began studying Greek, which is actually to sit down and read Homer and Plato in the original. And I had a sense that there was something in these texts that was worth knowing, that there was some wisdom in Plato or Aristotle or Homer that I wanted to have an unmediated encounter with. I wanted to be able to do this in the original. And that's why I signed up for Greek. But one of the things that's happening, I think, in the American Academy is that there's something of a bait and switch going on in classics departments. Is that students come to classics departments, come to study Greek and Latin precisely because they want to read the texts in the original. They want to, maybe they're interested in mythology or in history or in philosophy. And so they sign up for a class to learn Greek, but what they're given on day one, even if it's not made explicit, is philology. They are taught philology. They're taught a lot about the language, they're taught how to analyze the grammar, and they're taught how to translate painstakingly from ancient Greek or Latin into English, but they're not actually taught how to read. And now, I know this might seem like a strange distinction, but you don't actually need to know the grammar of a language or about the philological or historical development of the linguistic history of a language in order to be able to read it. It's sort of the equivalent of a child that wants to learn how to ride a bike, first being taught all of the physics of how they are propelled forward on that bicycle and how it works, rather than actually just getting on the bicycle and riding it. Right? There is a difference here between theory and praxis. I think that people that are attracted to classics, they're attracted to the practice of it, right? Not particularly to the theory. I myself, when I signed up for Greek, I didn't even know what a philologist was. I didn't know what philology was. I certainly didn't grow up dreaming that I would become a philologist. And now I have sometimes joke I have a PhD in classical philology, but that sort of happened by accident, right? That was never the intention. I didn't start studying Greek in order to learn philology, but that's what I was presented with when I got to the study of Greek. And I'd like to suggest that there's something more problematic about the way that Greek and Latin are taught than just the fact that students don't actually learn how to read Greek and Latin. You would think that would be the biggest problem with this method, but it's not. And I think that my experience is not unique among students that study Latin or Greek, or any language for that matter, because unlike for first language acquisition, where the rule is always success, almost no one fails to learn their first language, the rule for second language acquisition is failure. Right? The majority of people who ever try to study to learn a foreign language, any foreign language, will fail and will not actually be able to achieve fluency in that language. And the situation is even more dire for Latin and Greek, precisely because of the methods that are employed in teaching them. And so I would like to suggest, as I said, that the biggest problem here is not with the fact that, well, people can put 4 or 5 or 6 years or even a decade of their life into studying the classical languages and not have anything to show for it, which I think is fair. But there's actually there's a deeper philosophical problem that relates to our orientation to the past that is inherent in the way in this philological or traditional method that is normally employed. So I've been thinking for about 20 years now about how to learn Greek and how to teach Greek. And what would be the best and most ideal circumstances for the learning of Greek. And for me, it was not originally a altruistic project, a vision for affecting the way that these languages are transmitted. It was not even an intellectual interest. It was something just perfectly selfish and practical, is that I failed myself to learn Greek, and I wanted to know why. And I wanted to fix that, and I wanted to actually learn Greek myself. And as I started asking my colleagues and also my professors, I started to have the sense that actually no one really was succeeding in learning Greek. Even my instructors, I hate to say it, but didn't seem to actually know the language that they were teaching well. And because of this, I decided to start looking into theories of language acquisition and the cognitive processes involved with the teaching of languages and language pedagogy, with the express purpose of figuring out, what went wrong with my study of Greek and how can I fix it. I began to experiment first on myself with Greek and then with other languages as well, and then ultimately with my students. And the field of second language acquisition is, it's somewhat of a mess, but I think I'm going to try to distill it down to its I think the simplest and the truest form, that how well you know a language is really the product of just one thing. It's the exposure that you have to the language. And what I mean by that is not just the number of years that you've spent studying a language. I mean this in a somewhat mathematical sense. And I'm not trying to give you numbers about this, but quite factually, the number of sentences and the number of words that go from outside of your brain to inside of your brain, whether through your eyes or your ears, will directly correlate to how well you know a language. And maybe this seems incredibly obvious, but I think it's certainly not when you look at what's going on in Latin and Greek classrooms today, because what normally happens in a Latin and Greek classroom is, well, first off, the entire class is conducted in English, right? You may have 10 sentences that you were supposed to have translated, or 20 sentences that you're supposed to have translated before the class, and you spend your time in the classroom talking about those sentences. You might not ever hear a word of Greek spoken over not just the semester, but your entire undergraduate career studying Latin or ancient Greek. And just to give you an example, at my upper level Greek classes as an undergraduate, the most Greek I was ever required to read was about 50 pages over the course of an entire semester. 50 pages over the course of the semester. And if you assume that there's maybe 200 words per page, right, that means I was exposed to about, 10,000 words of Greek, which is not a lot, unfortunately. Just to, the Greeks themselves, modern Greeks, we don't know exactly how fast the ancient Greeks spoke. I mean, we think that the Athenians spoke pretty quickly if we judge by all the vowel contractions that we see in their dialect. But modern Greeks will tend to speak at a rate of 90 to 100 to 110 words per minute, which means around 6,000 to 7,000 words per hour. And so I know this is not a very fair comparison, but you could say that listening to a Greek podcast for about an hour and a half or 2 hours would expose your brain to more Greek than I was exposed to over the course of the entire semester studying Greek at the highest level. And this is something, well, it's not exactly a fair comparison, but it can show you that language acquisition can happen on the level of the hour, the week, and the month, and not necessarily on the level of the year and the decade. And that the normal standards that we think about for progress in a language, they're based on a faulty system that actually doesn't do the work of exposing students to the language itself. Now, the two fundamental changes that need to happen in not just Greek and Latin classrooms, but in language classrooms generally to ensure that students actually learn the language are two. There's one is extensive reading, which means you actually just have to read a lot, right? And this also seems very obvious, but reading 50 pages a semester or 200 pages of Greek over the course of your entire 4 years or 5 years of studying the language is not sufficient. You need hundreds of thousands of sentences to actually begin the process of language acquisition. Your brain is actually quite good at finding patterns in a language if you just feed it with enough material. And the most important ingredient is quantity. It's not quality, it's quantity. You just need to expose yourself to enough of the language for your brain to start being able to perceive those patterns. This is how we all learned our first language. This is how we learn second languages as well. The problem that we're faced with in the classics is that we're all focused on quality rather than quantity, because the texts that we have received are all of the highest quality. So we slow ourselves down and we read at a pace of, a paragraph an hour or 2 hours. But by doing so, we never allow our brains to acquire the quantity that's actually needed to learn the language, to learn the patterns and the rhythms of the language. The second thing that we can do, first is, of course, extensive reading simpler texts, making sure our students read a lot more, is speaking the ancient languages. And this is something that, it's growing quite in popularity over the past decade or 2 decades, movements of both spoken Latin and spoken ancient Greek. And I think the reason is that we intuitively understand that, if you can speak a language, you know it a lot better than if you can't speak a language, and that bringing the language alive does much more than just ensure that you learn the language. It also affects a psychological and a philosophical transformation in the mind of the learner, and it changes their orientation to the past. But just on a purely practical level, as I was saying before, if you speak ancient Greek, for example, with your students in an hour-long class, and you expose them to, 5,000, 6,000 words of Greek, how much more? Over the course of an entire week, they might be exposed to more Greek than they could have been in a traditional classroom over the course of, 4 or 5 or 6 years, as I was. And as we've seen, I think, now with the growth of podcasts and long-form material, people often have a much easier time listening to things than they do reading things. And when you're learning a language, an appeal always needs to be made to the ear rather than just to the eye. We're not very good at learning languages just with our eyes. We need to hear things. And part of it has to do with the mechanism of language acquisition, but also part of it has to do with the human element of language acquisition, that we actually learn languages to connect with other human beings. Those human beings may be dead, right? They may be communicating to us with texts or through texts, but the main goal and the main mechanism of language acquisition comes through the interaction with other human beings. And we're not very good at abstracting that to the text unless we first have examples of that in the here and now. And so I think that these are the two things that can be done in the language classroom to change the way that people learn Greek and Latin, and to make it, more of a viable proposition. Because I think there's a lot of people that would like to know ancient Greek, and they would say, oh, I would love to be able to read Plato in the original or read some Homer, right? But if you tell them that they have to spend 5 years doing it, 6 years doing it, and at the end of it, they still won't be very good at it, no one is going to do it. And so I'd now like to offer, by way of an example, some of the pedagogical principles that I've put into place now at Ralston College, which is now in its third year. We have an MA in the Humanities, and the MA in the Humanities starts with a 2-month intensive program in both ancient Greek and modern Greek simultaneously in Greece. And I've made a number of very radical pedagogical decisions, certainly in the American context, radical pedagogical decisions in this program. And I'd like to explain, why. And I'd like to then conclude by talking about, what is the real issue that we're facing? Because I don't think that the issue is just one of the failure to transmit the languages, but that is a big component. If no one actually knows the languages, then we're going to be reliant on intermediaries and translations, and eventually our connection with the past is going to fall away entirely. So in our Greek program at Ralston, as I said, we start it in Greece, which is already radical enough. We teach 2 languages simultaneously, so we teach both ancient Greek and modern Greek at the same time, and I'll reflect a little bit about why I think that that's not just important, but essential for progress in ancient Greek. We also, I know this won't be perhaps as radical in the current crowd, but we use the Greek system of pronunciation for ancient Greek, not the Erasmian or the restored pronunciation of ancient Greek. I'd love to talk about that. I don't know if I'll have time to mention this in this talk, but perhaps in the Q&A we can talk about this. I actually think that it's not that it's impossible to learn ancient Greek with the Erasmian pronunciation, but it's next to impossible to actually develop a comfort and a facility with the rhythms and the vocabulary of Greek without reference to the way that Greek is actually pronounced today. I don't think that the restored pronunciation is sufficient for building fluency, but that's another topic. And a third, and most importantly, we speak ancient Greek. From the very first day, all of our ancient Greek classes are conducted entirely in ancient Greek. There is no teaching language, right? We do not use English, right? From the very first day, the students all are exposed to fluent, spoken ancient Greek. What's really at stake with all of these decisions, all of the entire pedagogy of our program, is the orientation to the past. I mean, it's not just about making our students more effective learners of Greek, which I think we have done, and we want them to learn Greek. But what we really want to do is, and I think this is the problem that we're facing, is that we want to change the way that we interact with the past. The problem with the philological method or the traditional method, the way that Greek and Latin are normally taught, as I said, is not just the fact that people fail to learn the languages by using that method. The real problem is that the method itself and the techniques of the method isolate us from the tradition. They actually cut us off from the tradition. You know, we live in a moment where we seem to have turned our backs on the past culturally. And I mean that in the Homeric sense. As you know, the ancient Greeks thought of the future as being behind us, and that we're walking backwards into the past because we're walking backwards into the future, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We're blind to it. We only look at the past, which is in front of us. And when we turn our back on the past, we're actually doubly blind, right? We can no longer see what we could have once saw, which was the past, and we're still marching blindly into the future. But you know, we have this sense that we've turned our back on the past in maybe to pursue progress or to pursue the future, and that is the predominant way of interacting, the predominant orientation towards the past. But there's another sort of, I guess, the reactionary stance to this is sort of as we've spoken about already tonight, the idolization of the past, classicism in its worst form, the blind worship of the past, in whatever period that is, whether it's the 1950s of America or Rome or Greece, it doesn't matter. But there is a third way of interacting with the past, and this third way is not a compromise between the two. It's just a third way, and it is, I think, a way of friendship, a way of love and of respect for the tradition. a form of participation in the tradition rather than stepping outside of the tradition and as sort of an analyst looking back on it and marking all of the caesura of the poetry or collecting all the shards of the amphora. Right? There's a sense in which when we go to a museum or when we look at an ancient text, we're doing it as if history has already ended and we're looking back on it, not acknowledging the fact that we are the inheritors of the tradition and that we are the participating in the tradition. And this third way of interacting with the past, I think, is most present, of course, in the Renaissance humanists themselves. And whether or not the Renaissance was a radical break with the past or reflected a continuity with the past, I think is a very interesting question. But certainly the greatest minds of the Renaissance, whether you take Petrarch or Erasmus, they thought of themselves not as the analyzers of the past, but of the inheritors, as of the inheritors of the tradition. They saw themselves as you look at Erasmus thinking about Ciceronian style. He thought himself as a link in a long chain that stretched back to antiquity and that was going to stretch forward into the future. It was a totally different understanding of his place in time. That he was not just sort of a product of his own era in the 1 week news cycle. He was thinking in terms of the millennia, both backwards and forward. Or you take a figure like Petrarch, who the father of the Renaissance, who himself lived through a terrible time, lost so many friends and loved ones, and found consolation in the ancient authors, carrying around everywhere with him a little version, a little minuscule edition of Augustine, memorizing passages, and most famously writing an entire book, an entire dialogue between himself and Augustine in Latin, in the presence of Lady Truth, because he saw the ancients as his friends, as people that could help him on his journey through life to address the problems that were most pressing, his own depression and his own struggles. He saw in the ancients true peers and friends. And it's only when you develop that relationship of friendship or peerhood with the ancients that you can then somewhat even dare to add something to it, right? Not just to transmit it or to preserve it in its form intact and give it to the next generation. Oh, that's a good first step. But then actually to dare to add something to it or to enter into a competition with the ancients, to vie with the ancients for not just beauty, but also for virtue. And that is the true, I think, the true third way. And it's this third way or this third orientation for interacting with the past, I believe that can only happen if, and I know this is somewhat of an extreme claim, but it can only happen if we ourselves try to the best of our abilities to speak the languages of the ancients, not just to read them, not just to analyze them, but to actually begin to speak Latin and Greek. And at least in the pedagogical context, this is how the languages are always, or have always historically been taught up until very recently, up until the last couple of centuries. But it's just, I mean, maybe this is also so obvious that it doesn't need to be said, but if you'd like to enter into a relationship of friendship and mutual respect with another individual, you cannot do it through a translator or through an interpreter. It's just simply impossible. If you would really like to be able to open your heart to another human being, whether ancient, dead, through text, or through another human being, you must do it through an unmediated interaction and encounter with the text. And for this reason, in our program at Ralston, in addition to teaching all of our students to be able to speak modern Greek and to be able to interact with the tradition and see and feel tangibly how the tradition is still alive, how the words themselves that they see in Homer are still present on the streets of Athens or on the beaches of Samos. We also speak the ancient languages, and we form friendships and a community with one another speaking ancient Greek. And it's through doing that we have the analogy, the tangible analogy for the proper interaction with the ancient texts. If we can form a relationship of friendship and of respect, a community founded on love and understanding today, we can also do that with the ancients, right? And then through that very action, through talking with our friends in ancient Greek about Plato or reading Plato with them, it's almost as if Plato comes into the conversation himself and can be not just someone that we put up on a pedestal or someone that we just wants to throw into the dustbin, but someone that can actually enter into our lives as a friend, as a support, and also as a challenge, right, for us, not just as someone that we want to blindly imitate, but as someone whose vices and problems we also want to avoid. And so I truly believe that it's only through a reform of the way that we think about the teaching of the languages that we can change the fundamental psychological and spiritual orientation of our students to the past. If we don't invite them into the tradition, if we only show them the tradition through the sterile glass of a museum. They'll never feel the need to, well, first off, to enter into it, and then second, to preserve it and protect it, and then third, to hand that down in a improved version to the next generation. Thank you.
So I told you that this was my dream team. I told you that we had chosen these three people for a reason. Those were three, of course, very, very different talks, but there are clear commonalities there. We heard about what's good and less good about the past, what's good and less good about the present, and, well, what we can do for the future. We have 20 or 25 minutes for questions. I suppose I will call on people. Please direct them at any or all of the panelists, and there are microphones going around. Sir. Let's just wait.
I'm Mark Katanos, Madam Ambassador, and those responsible for bringing this important topic and this esteemed group of scholars. Thank you. I thought the situation, the crisis, was very well presented. There were a couple of solutions suggested. I would love to see that the next panel that's coming, is it next month, I believe, talk more about solutions. For example, if money, for example, is a factor in helping improve the situation, and Livanos or Katsimatidis chair goes to University X, Y, and Z, etc., is a situation so dire that money is not going to be much help.
I will say only that one of the three panelists in November is actually here, so you might speak to her, Professor Claire Catanacho, George Harris in the back.
First of all, it was very stimulating. And by the way, I'm Alexander Skremos. I'm a little bit of an outsider. I'm a physicist, but I like history. So life experience and some comments. The life experience is when I went to Edinburgh to learn physics, mathematical physics. The first thing they told me about language was I need to learn the Greek alphabet because I was pronouncing alpha, beta, gamma, delta. And they told me, no. You have to learn it as alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and so on. So I had to learn it again, Greek alphabet. But the key point here is that natural scientists are not against history, and it's not like the strongest will survive. I think the future of classics is to fuse with each other and classics to, in a way, to revise many of its holy traditions. I'll give you an example that I read in a book. And the book was claiming that many of the classics believe that Amazons are mythological creatures. Even though ancient Greeks painted them in vases, it was the second most popular topic, and they constantly were talking about it. But modern historians, even art critics, were saying, no, Amazons is just a fantasy of men who wanted to fantasize things. And yet, when there were excavations in modern Ukraine, the last 3-4 decades, they were finding graves of warriors. And they said, okay, 2/3 are men and 1/3 is weird men. The skeletons was a bit different. It was only with the analysis of DNA that they found out, oh, these weird men are actually women. And maybe these women are Scythians, or as the Greeks were saying, oh, it's Amazons. So And there are other things like the pioneer work by Joseph Aubert, who was many years in Princeton, writing about the Athenian society, its democracy. Now he's at Stanford. What he's doing is he's taking history and trying to combine it with economics, sociology, even game theory, in order to explain and educate people that in history in a new way, to try to understand these people that lived thousands of years ago in a unique way. So my question is to any of the panelists who wants to answer that question is, will classics start collaborating more actively with other sciences, including natural sciences?
This good? Yes. Maybe I'll hold it right there. Yes, look, we've had thank you for the question. So if I understood the point of the question is, might classics benefit from greater collaboration with some of the fields which Eric described as having posed a historical challenge to it and gradually displacing it, such as the natural sciences and maybe even the social sciences. So with greater collaborations across fields and disciplines, the classics might be revitalized this way, find a new place there. And that is certainly worth considering. And there are a great many classicists who have done something like this. The question which I think Eric might address is that you can have the archaeologists working on the study of ancient seeds that they discover. So we have learned more through various forms of scientific dating. We can have any number of things. The study of manuscripts benefit from, and papyri benefit from sciences. And all of this is good. I am not sure, however, whether it addresses the fundamental question, which is that does it risk reducing the study of the ancient world and classics as something more than the mere acquisition of knowledge about the past? And I don't mean to deny the importance of that. We always want more knowledge about everything, as far away as the stars and what the ground beneath our feet. But the classics as a kind of cultural practice is not about simply acquiring more and more precise knowledge about the sorts of things that the natural sciences can answer. It has this additional dimension to it, which merits the sort of discussion that we've been having. What is it for? What sort of purposes do we put it to? Again, I don't want to pretend here that I have some sort of definitive answer. But anyway, I'll stop there.
If I may add, I agree with all of that. And I also am not in any way opposed to people doing interdisciplinary work, relating classics to the social sciences, the natural sciences, and so forth. I'm sure a lot of that work is very exciting and interesting. But one of the things that I was trying to get across in my presentation is that since the late 19th century, with the professionalization of American higher education, the classics and other humanities disciplines have been forced into the box of thinking themselves as sciences, and that this has had a profound impact on the way that they do business. And that if you yourself went and tried to read an issue of the latest peer-reviewed classics journal, Classical Philology or American Journal of Philology or what have you, if you don't have a classics PhD, you will throw that across the room as quickly as possible because it is completely boring to you. And the reason is that these are people who are writing only for other fellow specialists. And I think that there's something nice about writing for fellow specialists. I don't think that there's no value to that. But one of the real problems we have today is that we are ignoring fundamental humanistic questions that should be of importance to any serious person who wants to lead a satisfying life. What does it mean to be a good person? What is justice? What is the good? What is beauty, right? And instead we want to ask, well, why don't we try to become handmaidens of the sciences? How about medical humanities? How about AI and the humanities and what have you? All these things are fine and good, but what I'm nervous about is that it turns us into more of the direction that we've been moving since the 19th century, which is scientizing the humanities rather than making the sciences more humane in our own education. I think ultimately that's a dead end.
My name is Kyriakopoulos. I'm a professor emeritus of engineering, so I guess I'm in a, let's say, an enemy crowd here. I really enjoyed the first presentation, the review, the overview of the classical education. However, I have a criticism. You omitted something extremely important that has bearing to what you were discussing. In the 18th and early 19th century, higher education was for the children of the elite. Those children did not have a need to earn a living. They had a living already set for them. Today's higher education is designed to produce people who can thrive in an equal society, call it a social, or say at all levels. The question that is, although the classics are an important tool in that, what does the classical education group do to adapt to the current needs of higher education as opposed to the needs of the 18th century? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I would first say that I don't think you're in enemy territory. I think that we need good education in lots of different areas. Humanities is something I'm concerned about because that's what I've dedicated my life to, but it doesn't mean that I'm not concerned about the sciences or engineering and so forth. Those should all play a part in higher education as well. I do think that it is true that the population of students in the 18th and into the 19th century was a smaller population of students. It would be incorrect to suggest that only very wealthy people went to college in those days. They actually had, from very early days, a number of ways in which poorer students could end up going. So it was not entirely the case that only the elite or ultra-elite from American society went to these colleges. However, it is certainly true that it was dominated by the elite, and it was dominated by elite interests. Another thing you can suggest, I think, is that in the 18th and into the 19th century, and earlier on as well, there were actual pragmatic benefits for studying the classics. Those people who went to the colleges largely went to study in one of the so-called learned professions, medicine, ministry, and law. And those were professions in which grounding in the classical languages was a necessity in those days. And so although there were lots of pie-in-the-sky rhetoric about what the benefit of this curriculum actually would be, at the same period of time, there were real pragmatic reasons why someone would want that sort of education. And those pragmatic reasons have largely disappeared. I completely agree that we need to craft a rationale for the classics and for the humanities more broadly that speaks to a large population of students. In some ways, in the late 19th century, the classics failed to broaden their purview to make themselves applicable to a larger population of students who are coming to the American colleges for the first time. Now what you see is the modern humanities are failing that same test. And so in some ways, what we need now is better arguments for why everyone should study the humanities to some degree. I'm less concerned personally if someone is interested in majoring in engineering or nursing or what have you. What I'm interested in is making sure that every student, regardless of what their major actually is, has some inkling of a humanistic education so that they might be able to live up to their higher potentialities as human beings. The greater the arguments we can offer, the broader the arguments we can offer for a genuine humanistic portion to their educations, I think the more the classics will thrive and the modern humanities will thrive.
My name is Magdalini Kandarji. I said in Greek because of the main point of discussion. Right? It was indeed a very valuable presentation tonight. Not only we learn about the development, the history of classics in America, in the United States, but also we are offered by a professor of Boston University. He gave us some new ideas of how to teach Greek and Latin in higher education in American universities. And I have another question. Some years ago, there was statistics that were published in Princeton Review that said undergraduates from classical studies are preferred from the schools of medical school, law school, and business schools, and especially at universities of the Ivy League universities, yes. So what do you have to say on that? Is this criterion or the selection criteria not valid anymore? Thank you.
We missed our chance to become most classics departments and variety of humanities departments, history departments, philosophy departments these days, like to showcase their graduates who went on to have, let's say, remunerative careers in law, medicine, business. And that's all well and good. And of course, the suggestion is always that we had a hand in this, in their success. You know, reading a lot of Virgil, making your way through the prose of Cicero, that made a difference. And perhaps in some indirect way that's hard to pin down, it did. But I think that that shows a failure of nerve, a lack of confidence in what it is that we do, or what it is that, what our purpose was supposed to be. And so we say, well, you can study classics and still have a good career, if you see what I mean. It's an admission that we are so insecure, we're so worried that students might not come otherwise. But the point of the humanities is to dispute that very model of education, that very idea. Which is not to say that people should not study medicine and law and engineering. It's that you come to us as well, perhaps, if not exclusively, for reasons other than what you might do with your degree moving on. And so, you know, there's this idea that the classics or humanities in general should not have to explain their utility. But I think sometimes the reason they've fallen into this state is because we have confused the need to look beyond utility with the fear that they might be useless. And that is on us. It's a failure on our part to provide other uses for the study of antiquity and a great many other things besides.
There was a question. Yes, I know there is here tonight. This was, yeah, it still was. Okay, there. All right, okay. I admit you, but all right. You two can fight it out.
All right, thank you. So my name's Adam Friend. I identify with the subject as a product of a thorough Jesuit education, including a whole healthy dose of humanities over many years, including a decent amount of the classics and Greek, Latin stories, never in the main language. I wanted to ask in general, when I've heard in a couple of these answers connotation between the classics and the humanities. And in the explanation of the benefit of the humanities, I would like to hear a distinction between how do we see, if we're talking of the crisis of the classics, how do we see the particular benefit of classical literature and studies versus broader humanities studies? I'll leave it at that.
Yes, so the Greeks have a word for just about everything, but they didn't have a word for humanitas, or for humanities, which is actually something that's quite astonishing about the history of humanities. It took Cicero in the 1st century BC to coin the term humanitas. And in the term humanitas, Cicero combined a number of Greek ideas, one of which was philanthropia, right? That the love for fellow mankind, right? And that's the humane part of the humanities. That's the part of the humanities that actually teaches us to synchronically love our fellow human beings. But he also attached the Greek concept of pedia, right? Of culture or of education, the thing that links us with the past. And the reason that I think this is relevant to your question is because when the humanities is being done properly, it's nurturing both sides of that cross, right? It's working both synchronically and diachronically. It's teaching us actually to have a respect synchronically for the rest of humanity. And it's also teaching us to be in communion with those who have come before us and those who will come after us. And I think the real crux of the humanities is that precisely those two things nourish one another. Is it precisely the deeper that we go in the tradition, right, in the study of the classics or of the old texts, the more, if they're being done properly, we can develop that sense of philanthropia, or the love for our fellow man. And those two things are connected. So that's just the beginning of an answer. But I do think that general humanistic study of other periods, it still follows this principle, right? That it's something that's meant to simultaneously connect us with our own cultural fathers, with a capital F, however we identify them, in an attempt to more closely bring us into union with those around us today. And if humanities is not being done in that way, then I think, quite frankly, it's not worth doing.
Let me just say, we are technically out of time, but there are so many hands, I've been given permission to keep it going a little bit while longer. So we're going to have at least two, you, and then you. And
A very brief question from me. Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentations. It was a very, very nice evening for me here. And we had the engineer and the physicist, and I happen to be both. My name is Dimitris Ioannou, and I teach silicon technology, so probably I'm a little bit responsible for all this confusing technology. But anyway, I was particularly interested on the character and the role of classics in building and developing character. So I'd like to know what a little bit a comment about character, the essence of character, and why isn't it a little bit problematic to assume only classics can lead to building of a character, or maybe there are other ways? You know, there are many people that don't even have degrees and have great characters.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, I mean, one of the problems with Renaissance humanism, at least as we look at it backward, is that it seems so narrow to us. And in some ways, it's so narrow, it seems so narrow that we have to explain it to our students. Why did people really think that one should only read texts from these two cultures and in particular times and ignore, later authors entirely, right? And obviously, there's a historical reason for this, which is the Renaissance, or the reflourishing of Europe, happened in large measure because of this great commitment to reading these classical authors. And so understandably, these Renaissance humanists perceived that these texts were a sort of key to the building of character. Also, they were based on ancient notions of education, Greco-Roman notions of education, in which the moral character of education was preeminent. So Seneca says, for example, it's better for a person to be good than to be learned, right? This gets across this notion that character development was really central to the Greco-Roman tradition of elite education. So it's certainly the case that you can learn about character through other sorts of texts merely than through classical texts. I mean, that seems so obvious to us, one doesn't even need to state this. And one should note that after the demise of the old classical curriculum, what came in its place for those who wanted some semblance of a kind of canon was not a classical canon, but instead a Western canon, a sort of from Plato to NATO kind of thing, in which you would also read Shakespeare and Milton and so forth, up to Freud and Marx and so forth. So that there are many kinds of humanistic texts through which one can learn character development. But I would suggest at the same period of time that the modern university and the kind of curriculum that dominates the modern university denies the importance of character development entirely. If we basically say to students, take whatever you want. Here's a large number of humanities classes. Some of them are on comic books, and some of them are on television shows, and some of them are on Taylor Swift, but some of them are on the Analects of Confucius, and some of them are on Homer and so forth. It doesn't matter. Pick whichever one you like. Then in some ways, what we're saying is that the role of the imagination in human flourishing does not matter, and that we cannot decide between texts that are of primary importance to human flourishing and those that are ephemera, right? And you can see this in American academic culture in a number of ways as well. So that, for instance, the notion in American academic culture that you could read great works and somehow possibly become a better person, more thoughtful, more engaged, more aware of life's great challenges, is in many cases seen as naive. This is kind of an embarrassing view to have, right? This same academic culture tends to believe that abolishing the police, if not our entire criminal justice system, is a deeply serious way of dealing with societal problems and possibly a panacea for society itself. That seems to me to suggest that people believe that institutional reform, or possibly the abolishment of institutions, is way more important than the problems in the human heart and what's good and what's bad in human nature. In some ways, we have a fundamentally unserious way of looking at human nature in American higher education. And in some ways, we're not going to have a good education if we don't take human nature much more seriously.
I'm Bourbouhakis. I spent over 50 years in planetary exploration, and I consider myself fortunate because I began classical studies in my last 2 years of high school. And I believe we should bring back the concept of spherical education. It is, the classics is a rich resource. It is rich in the sense that it addresses serious life questions. It poses concerns and reason for thought. And it leads you through its way of sometimes meandering into the path where you can find for yourself answers to these questions. So I look to the day where the crisis is over and where young folks respect the idea of knowing more about this world than the narrow path that we take in our
I think that's a good way to close things out this evening. Madam Ambassador, thank you again for having us so much. Professor Koliatzis, thank you, and Sophia for corralling me so that I could then corral these three people. Thanks to all of you, but of course,